Good morning again, Chukwunuh, everybody. At this time, I'm going to call forward Tk'emlúps Secwépemc Chief and Council to please join me on the stage here so that we may introduce you to the world. So all of Tk'emlúps Secwépemc Chief and Council Cookbee, Rosanne and Council, please come join us up here in front on the stage so that we may introduce you to the world. Cookbee, what I'm going to suggest is you come here to the microphone first to introduce your council, and then you step forward so that we may take a photo. Katie's still on her way. Okay.
Waikwaitip, Cookbee Rosanne Casimir West, Tk'emlúps Secwépemc. I am very, very honored to be up here with my Kamipas, my counselors of the Kamloops. And I am very, very proud to have them here with all of us today and with all of you to witness the sharing of information and some of our next steps. So I'm going to introduce my council members from right to left. Very proud to have Councillor Jeanette Jules, Councillor Marie Baptiste, Councillor Thomas Blank, Councillor Justin Gottfredson, and I would also like to acknowledge our other two council members. One is still en route, Councillor Katie Gottfredson and Councillor Sunny Leonard. So again, I'm very, very proud and very honored to be standing with all of them here today in solidarity and unity.
Please join us. We can just stay here while we get Cookbee to join you for. So Walter, if you could give the crew a wave. Walter, photographer. Walter, yep. Just give them a wave. Let them. Could you get the? Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much to Tk'emlúps Secwépemc Chief and Council for joining us today. Again, we acknowledge that Councillor Katie Gottfredson is en route, and we also acknowledge Councillor Sunny Leonard. At this time, it is my joy and my honor to call upon Tk'emlúps Secwépemc Culture and Language Revitalization Department to start us off in a good way with the welcome song. So please come forward, and I'll just ask you to kindly come behind the podium so that your beautiful singing and drumming can be recorded and shared with the world. Tk'emlúps, and one tiny note of human error, and that is that it's the Culture and Language Revitalization Department, not Society, as it was listed on the slide. So the Tk'emlúps Culture and Language Revitalization Department. Again, thank you so very much, Tk'emlúps, for joining us today. To start us off in a good way, as is our protocol, I am honored and delighted to call upon knowledge keeper, Kia'a, and the most incredible Secwépemc language champion, a pillar of our nation, Kia'a Mona Jules. While Kia'a Mona Jules is making her way to the stage, I just want to point out all the beautiful aspects that we have here that was provided to us by the department, the Culture and Language Revitalization Department, and as well as pulling pieces from the Secwépemc Museum to really highlight our culture today.
Twinuk Providing Salkton. Nog een jichte mis mammeld pien de zietret. Een rent wielg en salktent. Ben meensel am iemts. Smammeld te small. Nes roche julig om zit mich. Ben mentem. Het hanne zachilt mes. Galt koekbee. Genoeg van de gewaard is het mamal te wachten alien te mich. Genoeg van de als het eerlijks, als je wilks, als je joods, en jou ze straks, pien wil maar jou galt koekbee. Genoeg van de dit la aquas in te mich, en jou is was das gewaard. Zo aks, gwaldans, kultens, was stammers. Maar elkst mens, maar jouw welk mens, met kunstes, met hannes achilmes. Alt koekbie, tjak da, dit lactans, is tjmamal te achpien. Knoeken da, is tjmamal te dak bestit lach arms, kwakt. Die tijd. Genoegen daar, galt koekbie. Als spok elk met hem, als wie ze zit nog aan. Zijn te zo aks. Galt koekbie. Genoegen daar, gewaard is tjmammeld, nes goge juligems, en kalme goedlig. Genoegen daar, is tjmammeld te the small Nisquequite Residential School, the Chatmatstum. Can you put this mammal that starts with like use Miss Hoochum, with a aquas, aquactus, Nasitas, new the school. Cockneen men and church what mu aquan, Alxwent look asses. Galt koekbie, gechichta, de kumchinach, as us, as la, so ach spien, will my youse. Galt koekbie, you eat skakalchin mention, oh ho.
My heartfelt gratitude to Kia'a Mona Jules for starting us off in a good way. We are going to be dealing with some difficult topics today, so it's so good to hear our language spoken, to connect ourselves to the greater than ourselves as well. At this time, I'm going to invite all the speakers who are able to join us in person today to come join me on the stage on either side of me. So I'm asking for all of our in-person speakers. We have a few that are also joining us virtually today, and we thank you as well for being prepared, and we're glad that you're ready to go with us. So, Chuchinu, my name is Rosselle Coy. I'm also known as Starlight Thunderhorse. I'm also known as Laloya. I'm also known by some other names from different ceremonies, and I'm honored today to serve as the moderator for today's public presentation, as well as for the media event that will immediately follow. My family hails from Canoe Creek First Nation, as well as the Lower Statliam area. I am a member of Secwépemc First Nation, which is the Lower Statliam, but I am very closely connected, and I honor my Secwépemc relatives from the Northern Secwépemc Tk'emlúps, and I'm really delighted and honored to be here today in Secwépemc Ulu. We recognize the territory of our Secwépemc ancestors today and where we're coming to you from. We have a full agenda today. For those of you who heard me talking just before we officially got started, we are, please, again, the speakers, I'm going to ask you to come forward while I'm talking. Please come forward. Cookby Rosanne, Sarah, others. If National Chief is here already, if she could please join us. When she gets here, we invite her to join us. I know she's, there you are. Thank you so much. So we are very fortunate, as you just heard me say. We have the Assembly of First Nations National Chief joining us today, and who will be providing some remarks. When I sent out the initial schedule, that was not yet confirmed, so we have expanded our timeline by a little bit to accommodate. Please take a seat. We have expanded our timeline by a little bit to accommodate that, so I trust your discretion with that as well, and the ability to accommodate that. To also be clear to all media, I know some media asked prior, I've confirmed with many, but if you're wondering, we absolutely encourage you to live stream this event. We also, for all people who are witnessing this around the world, please invite people to share and bear witness on this important event today. So with that, it is my pleasure to call upon Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc Cookby, Rosanne Casimir, for some opening remarks.
Waikopaitip, Cookby Rosanne Casimir, Winsquest, Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to the Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc Cultural and Language Revitalization Department for starting us off in a very good way by singing the welcome song and welcoming all of you here today. Also, I would like to say a heartfelt Kuksjatchum to Kia Mona Jules for starting us off in a good way with the grounding, the much needed grounding that we needed through prayer to the Creator, and Kuksjam. So as we begin this public presentation today, I want to begin by acknowledging Indian Residential School survivors and intergenerational survivors. There are no words sufficient to express the comfort and love that we wish to express to all of you today. We see you, we love you, and we believe you. I also want to acknowledge all of the communities that are grappling with their recent findings. We grieve with you in this confirmation of further missing children at other Indian residential schools. We stand with you and we move forward on to the next steps to address these heart-wrenching findings. Kuksjatchum to the Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc Council and members for joining me today. It is together that we can face such daunting work and ensure as caretakers that we move forward with deepest respect and love for these missing children. I stand here today strong because of the immense support that start both with our community and that I have received from the community since the news broke out on May 27th. I am so thankful to be joined today by Secwépemc Kusautsins, our Secwépemc relatives from across Secwépemc. I also want to say Kuksjatchim and thank you to Splatsin Cookby Wayne Christian, who is here with us, Nisconlith Cookby Judy Wilson, Canoe Creek Cookby Hank Adam, also to Phyllis Webstad, ambassador and a founder of the Orange Shirt Society. I would also like to say that we also have Sid Lecky from the city RCMP, and we also have William Wallace and Dee with us today from our local detachment. Additionally, I also want to thank the following people for joining me today. The Assembly of First Nations National Chief RoseAnne Archibald. The British Columbia Assembly of First Nations Regional Terry Chiji, who is also with us. The Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs Vice President, Chief Don Tom, as well as Secretary Treasurer, Cookby Judy Wilson. First Nations Summit Executive Robert Phillips. And our friend, the City of Kamloops Mayor, Ken Christian. So we are here today because Indian Residential School survivors and intergenerational survivors who were unrelenting in carrying those painful truths about missing children forward. From those who witnessed the abuse and neglect that could have led to death, to those who required to dig graves. We are forever thankful for your willingness to carry this burden of truth forward so that we could verify that knowing, confirming with science, and where some of the missing children's current resting place is located on the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. For everyone joining us today, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks. As you are bearing witness, and in doing so, you are ensuring that Indian Residential School survivors are finally being heard about the deaths of children in the residential schools after so many years of silence and disbelief. You are bearing witness to a very important truth about Indigenous people and Canada. It has been referred to as a historic dark chapter, but Indigenous people are very much alive with the repercussions that they're living today. I am so thankful for the inner strength and the fortitude that I have witnessed Indigenous people draw upon to continue forward despite the current and historic impacts that we shoulder. As I begin to delve further into the harsh reality regarding the missing children, I first wish to remind everyone this is heavy truth. For those present in person, I would like to remind you that we have cultural and wellness supports in the adjacent room across the hall. For those joining us remotely, please know that there are crisis lines that are publicly available, and have been well publicized. The Kamloops Indian Residential School was run by the Roman Catholic Church, albeit that words of regret and remorse have been expressed by local and regional Roman Catholic representatives. There has never been an apology from the highest level of the Roman Catholic Church. To be clear, the Roman Catholic Church has repeatedly refused to accept responsibility or formally apologize for its direct role in the numerous and horrific abuses committed by Indigenous and children through the residential school system. Despite having operated over 70% of all residential schools in Canada, they sought to reduce their obligations to contribute funds to reconciliation purposes. In 2016, Canada permitted the Catholic entities to escape their requirement to raise at least $25 million as part of the class action settlement, leaving only $4 million that they raised for these purposes, excusing the $21 million obligation that was unfulfilled. As we think about the Roman Catholic Church, let us all recollect that it was the federal government of Canada that mandated the Indian residential school system. In addition, the federal government that passed the law that permitted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to forcibly remove children from their families and communities to be enrolled in Indian residential schools. We are not here for retaliation. We are here for truth-telling. We are here today to honor the missing children in our caretakership who have experienced unthinkable circumstances leading to their death and whose remains were placed in unmarked graves. We are mapping a way forward to bring peace to those missing children, their families, and their communities. We will follow the evidence as it is disclosed. We will follow the science while we pay heed to what oral telling survivors share with us. With that, it is my honor to call forward the ground penetrating radar specialist, Dr. Sarah Beaulieu from the University of Fraser Valley, to present the findings from the investigation that she conducted on behalf of the Tk'emlúps de Secwépemc. Keep going. Okay, keep going. There you go. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Dr. Sarah Beaulieu. I'm a faculty associate in the Community Health and Social Innovation Hub at the University of the Fraser Valley. I would like to acknowledge that the University of the Fraser Valley is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Stalo people. I was honored to be invited by the Tk'emlúps Secwépemc based on my experience to conduct the survey of ground penetrating radar, also known as GPR. I'm closing in on a decade of work using GPR within a burial context. My experience with GPR has been used in both Indigenous cemeteries as well as city cemeteries. I have also been called upon by the Canadian First World War Interment Recognition Fund to locate unmarked prisoner of war burials as part of Canada's first national interment operations. In fact, the GPR that was used for this survey was provided by the Canadian First World War Interment Recognition Fund to help complete important work such as this. I've been asked to present the findings of this preliminary investigation. In order to do so, I will first discuss the cultural protocols pertinent to this investigation. I will then provide you with the information pertaining to the specific survey locations. Next, I will discuss the use of GPR within a burial context and present some of the common burial features that are used to make these determinations. I will also provide you with the technical slides that will present the data from the site and take you through the analysis of how these subsurface anomalies became targets of interest. And finally, I will present my findings, analysis, and discuss a path forward. From the outset of this preliminary survey, it was important to include community members in the design, the process, interpretation, and review of this investigation. This meant that incorporating Indigenous values, ceremonies, and methods was an essential part of this process. Cultural protocols took place prior to, during, and after the survey was completed, while oral histories from knowledge keepers and cultural monitors guided the specific survey locations. I would like to pay my respects to the cultural monitors and the knowledge keepers whom were present to monitor, provide oral histories, as well as the requisite ceremonies. Cultural protocols are as equally important as the science behind GPR. And given the nature and sensitivity of this work, one cannot be done without the other. It is important to note that remote sensing, such as GPR, is not necessary to know that children went missing in the Indian residential school context. This fact has been recognized by Indigenous communities for generations. Evidence has existed in government and church archives for more than a century. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report identified between 4,000 and 6,000 missing children, but anticipated that these actual numbers would be much greater. All residential school landscapes are likely to contain burials of missing children. Remote sensing, such as GPR, merely provides some spatial specificity to this truth. Between May 21st and 24th, 7,000 square meters of land, just under 2 acres, was covered in the location of the apple orchard at the Secwépemc Museum and Heritage Park. This area of interest was chosen for the survey based on a number of factors. First, the knowledge keepers' oral histories that recall children as young as 6 years old being woken in the night to dig holes for burials in the apple orchard. Second, a juvenile rib bone that surfaced in the same area. Third, a juvenile tooth that was excavated from a shovel test pit during an impact assessment conducted by Simon Fraser University's Archaeology department. A juvenile tooth is not an indicator of loss of life, but given both discoveries, the possibility should not be discounted. As a preliminary assessment, this project sought to first ascertain the likelihood of human burials within the study area. Second, begin a preliminary assessment of the possible locations of specific burials. And finally, develop steps to further this work in order to confirm the number and location of possible burials. In GPR terminology, a subsurface anomaly refers to any irregularity noted below the surface, while a target of interest suggests that the anomaly has an increased index of suspicion for being the object of the search. As a preliminary assessment, the GPR was conducted in prospection mode. This means ranging across the study zone, following the guidance of the community members, capturing anomalies as screenshots in the digital video logger, and flagging anomaly locations on the ground for further investigation. In addition, grid surveys were conducted for in-depth study as a trial for recommended next steps. When surveying specifically for burials, there are a number of factors that we must take into account during the analysis of GPR data for subsurface anomalies. The type of burial, whether it be casket, a vault, or natural, will result in notable differences in the reflection signatures, while a casket can be further differentiated based on the material that's used, typically wood or metal. The date of the burial will also affect whether the casket is intact or has deteriorated or collapsed. Further, when surveying for natural burials with no casket, one must pay attention to the very subtle soil disturbances reflected in the data. While the depth of the burials can change based on age at time of death and the season in which the burials were dug, typically shallow graves for smaller burials such as juveniles and frozen ground prior to mechanical excavation would also affect the burial depths. Thus, when a grave was dug in the winter, prior to the use of machinery, the depth of the grave was limited by the challenge in penetrating frozen ground. The common features of a formal burial in a cemetery setting typically include a convex reflective pattern at the upper surface of a grave shaft, vertical refractive patterns at the sides of the grave shaft, a horizontal reflective pattern at the base of the grave, and also a range of possible reflective patterns for the contents of the grave. These features are not exclusive to burials. However, in areas where burials are expected, they can act as preliminary confirmation of the likelihood that burials exist and of their specific locations. This slide provides you with a visual of GPR data acquired within a typical Canadian cemetery context with formal burials. This is not data from the Kamloops Indian Residential Site. The gray screen on the right with the two red lines running through it is known as a radargram. This is what we see on our GPR screens while we are in the field. On this screen, we can see the signature hyperbolic response of an adult burial 1.8 meters below the surface. This hyperbolic response correlates with the adult burial in the blue screen on the left. The blue screen on the left is recorded in slice view and exemplifies a grid system conducted in 25 centimeter transects. This provides a bird's eye view moving incrementally below the surface where one can view the entire gridded section at once. In this case, an adult burial on the right and a child's burial on the left. It should be noted that the colors on this screen are arbitrary. Typically, dark blue represents the areas with no soil disturbance, while red represents areas with the deepest level of soil disturbance. Thank you. The total number of burials of missing children at the Kamloops Indian Residential School landscape is currently unknown, as this was a preliminary investigation. My report identifies some of these probable locations. There remain over 160 acres that still require surveying before these numbers can be finalized. From my preliminary findings in May to today's results, reports providing additional information related to disturbances from archaeological impact assessments, as well as construction in parts of this area, were subsequently provided to me. These reports were reviewed in order to determine which of these locations overlapped with the GPR survey areas. After this review, it was determined that there remain 200 targets of interest in these preliminary results. Again, here, I must indicate that this is the first part of an investigation with a knowing and oral histories that tells us that there remain much more work to be done. The following 4 slides present examples of some of the data images from this investigation. I will use them to help illustrate the process of data and responses. I will also provide some illustrative highlights on these graphics that indicate some of the signature responses used in determining why these subsurface anomalies are targets of interest. In the following slides, I will call the targets of interest probable burials, as they demonstrate multiple GPR characteristics of burials, but only forensic investigation with excavation will be able to conclusively determine this. In the following screen captures, the x-axis indicates the length scanned on the surface, while the y-axis indicates the depth of anomalies below the surface. In each of the following screen captures, you will also notice a faint gray dot marked under each of these probable burials. This was a mark that I had placed on my GPR screen in the field in order to make note of these particular anomalies for further analysis. On this slide, the probable burial is located to the right of your screen. The probable burial contains multiple GPR characteristics of a burial. First, the orange semicircle indicates the convex reflective pattern of the upper surface of the grave shaft that lies approximately 0.7 meters below the surface. The red arrows indicate the vertical refractive patterns of the sides of the grave shaft. Above this, a surface depression can also be seen above the potential grave shaft. Surface depressions are common at known cemetery sites. Depressions occur over time when the loose soil used to fill a burial shaft compacts or when a coffin eventually collapses. Now let me take you to the middle part of the screen capture where we see tree roots that are located just past the 5-meter mark, just the previous screen. These roots have a lower amplitude signal as well as a smaller hyperbolic response, which begin right at the surface and not too far below it. On the second screenshot, it contains several different anomalies that can be contrasted with the probable burial. Here, the probable burial is noted on the right of the screen as well, just past the 15-meter mark. It has a notable soil disturbance above the hyperbolic response, in addition to reflections from the edge of the vertical grave shaft. The reversed polarity of the wave, seen here as black, white, black, indicates a void space below this hyperbolic response. Now, immediately prior to the 15-meter mark, we can see the low amplitude signals from the tree root system. And at the 7-meter mark, we can also see what we call ring down signatures, which is indicative of a metal object below the surface. Both the tree roots as well as the metal object are much smaller hyperbolic responses and are located near the surface, unlike the probable burial that remains 0.8 meters below the surface. In this third screen capture, the probable burial is observed with a larger, more rounded hyperbolic response just past the 20-meter mark. It also lies approximately 0.7 meters below the surface. There is a distinct soil disturbance above the area where the probable burial is located, and there's also a clay layer that abruptly terminates where the probable burial is located and continues again after it. This probable burial can be contrasted with the much smaller stone located to the left of the screen just prior to the 15-meter mark, which demonstrates a smaller, much sharper hyperbolic response. The purpose of these slides is to demonstrate that there are many different anomalies that can be seen beneath the surface, and each of these present with a different set of signatures that require a specialized skill set to analyze and interpret. This would be no different than the skill sets required by a physician in order to read and interpret an X-ray. In this final screen capture, it represents one of the areas that we gridded on the site. The blue grid on the left is recorded in slice view, and the data on the right represents a single line of the same grid, indicating a target of interest that correlates with the area in the left screen capture. Next slide. In addition to the GPR characteristics of burials noted in the survey area and presented in the previous screen captures, I will reiterate that there was additional supporting evidence. The depressions in the orchard that correlate with the subsurface anomalies observed in the GPR data. There was an east-west configuration of the subsurface anomalies in the orchard that support typical Christian burial traditions. The juvenile rib, bone, and tooth discovered in the same survey location. And finally, but most importantly, the ceremonial knowledge keepers' oral histories that recall burials in this location. A preliminary investigation such as this is not intended to provide exact numbers or final results, but rather to confirm the existence of burials. These results are as conclusive as GPR allows, but only forensic investigation with excavation will provide definitive results. In my experience, though, approaching a decade of work using GPR within a burial context, there are very likely to be many human burials in the study area. Further remote sensing, such as GPR, should be conducted to locate all possible burials. After all, this investigation has barely scratched the surface, covering just under 2 acres of the total 160-acre residential school site. In concluding this presentation, I would like to circle back to a statement that I made at the beginning. Remote sensing such as GPR is not necessary to know that children went missing in the Indian residential school context. This fact, this knowing, has been recognized by Indigenous communities for generations. All residential school landscapes are likely to contain burials of missing children, and remote sensing such as GPR merely provides some spatial specificity to this truth.
Cookschaacham, I raise my hands to you, Sarah, for the diligence and dedication you have provided to Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc on this very important file. At this time, we're going to turn virtually to Dr. Lisa Hodgetts, who is the president of the Canadian Archaeological Association. So please welcome Dr. Lisa Hodgetts. Oh, you are, I don't know if you're muted or we need to get the sound on our end. Just one moment, please, if you want to just say hello to us again till I work on the sound. We have no sound for her, so just a minute, Dr. Lisa.
I'll try again.
There we go, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Lisa Hodgetts. I'm the president of the Canadian Archaeological Association, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Western Ontario. I'm joining you from London, Ontario today, and I want to acknowledge that London is on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenathewack, and the Attawandaron peoples. I've been an archaeologist for 30 years. I'm a settler. My family's roots are in Britain. But for the last 15 years, it's been my privilege to do my archaeological work in close collaboration with Indigenous communities, and in particular with the Inuvialuit of the Western Arctic. I'm very grateful to the Tk'emlúps First Nation for the invitation to be here to bear witness today. Many thanks to Dr. Beaulieu for her excellent report. It's clear that she brings a great deal of expertise and also a great deal of heart and commitment to do the work in the respectful way, and a way that's culturally appropriate. She gave us a great overview of what ground penetrating radar can and can't tell us. As Kamloops Casimir noted at the outset, the news of Dr. Beaulieu's findings and similar findings from other residential school sites in recent weeks has brought to the surface a lot of pain and trauma for many Indigenous communities, and especially for survivors, intergenerational survivors, and their families. I hope so much that they've found some comfort in the massive outpouring of support that we've seen from around the world. I think it's unfortunate, as Dr. Beaulieu noted, that it took this science to wake the world up to the truth that survivors and their communities have known for years, and is so clearly documented in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports from 2015. The TRC laid out a path towards healing that would allow us to build respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. And I think it's time for all Canadians to hold the Government of Canada, other levels of government, and the churches that ran so many of these schools accountable. They can talk about reconciliation, but until we see real movement to implement all 94 calls to action of the TRC, those are just empty words. Given the massive size of the area around the Kamloops school, the 200 targets of interest, those probable burials that Dr. Beaulieu identified, are only the beginning. It was a very small area that she investigated, and further work is clearly required to confirm the number and the location of potential graves at the site. It's also really important that we remember that Kamloops is only one of 139 schools in the Indian residential school system. We also know that there were other schools, day schools and residential schools, that weren't covered by the TRC. So 139 is not the whole number. We're talking clearly about thousands and thousands of missing children. And given this huge scale, I think it's clear that the funding that's currently been provided by governments for investigating and commemorating these missing children is going to fall short. Every Indigenous community has the right to self-determination. That's outlined by the TRC and in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which the Government of Canada adopted the recommendations of in 2016. And that means that communities can and should chart their own path at their own pace when it comes to their missing children. They need the resources and the time to do this important, very heavy work to the highest standard and with all the required supports in place. This is clearly not something that communities should have to pay for themselves. If communities choose to investigate unmarked graves, there are a range of options that are open to them and many different possible steps in the process. As communities navigate this path, we know that many of them have questions. The Canadian Archaeological Association is working really hard to provide a reliable, independent source of information for Indigenous communities to help them make informed decisions. Our expertise lies in the area of remote sensing to find unmarked graves, which, as I said, is only one of a series of steps that are open to communities. We've created a working group on unmarked graves that brings together archaeologists from across the country who have experience in working collaboratively and respectfully with Indigenous communities to help them find their missing children. And I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Kisha Supernant, who is the chair of our working group, so that she can say a bit more about our efforts. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm on. Tanse, Kisha Supernant Nitsikatson, and Miss Kuchiwiskaigan Utinia, the Michif Mia. Hello, and I'm Dr. Kisha Supernant. I am Métis, and I'm director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology, as well as an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta. And I'm also the chair of the Unmarked Graves Working Group of the Canadian Archaeological Association. I'm coming to you today from the lands of Treaty 6 and the Métis homeland in Edmonton, Alberta. And I too am honored to have been invited to participate in this event today. I want to begin by thanking the speakers so far and to support the clear communication of the results that Dr. Beaulieu had provided. It's clear from this, that there is an accurate use of best practices in an exploratory and preliminary assessment. I've been working collaboratively with Indigenous communities for over 15 years, and over the past several years have been developing capacity to apply ground penetrating radar and other remote sensing techniques to the detection of unmarked graves in many different contexts. And I am very reassured by the results presented today and confident that these results indicate a number of highly probable burials and targets that definitely warrant further investigation. And I think one of the big challenges facing communities, as my colleague Dr. Hodgetts has pointed out, is the scope and scale of the landscapes that require this investigation. This was a small portion of a large area around the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and there is much more work that needs to be done. The Unmarked Graves Working Group is committed to supporting communities should they be seeking independent expert advice around the application of remote sensing technologies to this work. And in the interest of supporting communities, we have developed some accessible resources, including a FAQ document, which outlines some of the types of remote sensing that can be used and some frequently asked questions about ground penetrating radar in particular. We've also provided, from our experience doing this work with Indigenous communities, a pathways document that suggests some steps that communities might consider, recognizing that remote sensing is not usually step one. We've heard repeatedly today about the knowledge held in communities by knowledge keepers and survivors and families around where burials are likely to be on these landscapes. And while I must echo that we shouldn't require the scientific application of GPR in order to confirm or validate stories and the experiences and the testimonies of those survivors, there is value in providing that spatial location of these probable graves. And it's important that communities are supported in that work. We also have released this morning a best practices overview for the collection of ground penetrating radar data around unmarked burials, specifically in terms of ground penetrating radar. And those are available on the Canadian Archaeological Association website. Our intention here is to establish and share some of those best practices around how information should be gathered from these sensitive sites in a respectful way, and using the application of ground penetrating radar to these difficult targets. And want to emphasize that while there are a number of people who might know how to use ground penetrating radar, using the equipment does not mean you know how to apply it in order to find unmarked burials. So we're seeking to provide important information for communities so that they can make informed decisions about how they wish to proceed. I also want to emphasize that there are a suite of other remote sensing technologies that could be applicable. Ground penetrating radar worked well in this context. It does not work well in all contexts. And so providing this information helps communities determine which approaches are most appropriate around their schools. I also want to emphasize that many of these schools have survivors from multiple nations, and communities need to be supported in bringing together those survivors as this work continues. And the scope and scale of it are truly immense. Communities must be resourced. Funding, expertise, and other resources that they are requesting must be provided as this work continues. We are hoping to continue to provide an independent source of expert advice should communities wish. And in the interest of supporting this, we are partnering, we've been invited to partner with the Kamloops Secwépemc on a free webinar, which will take place next week, July 22nd, beginning at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And it will review best practices around the application of remote sensing for grave detection and bring together experts from across the country to be able to explain what some of these technologies do and how they might be applied to unmarked burials around residential schools. This is a long road. There is much work yet to be done, and we are only beginning this journey that survivors and communities have been asking for a very, very long time. And I'm grateful to have been here to be able to provide some of this information and to confirm the excellent work of Dr. Beaulieu and to support Tk'emlúps as they continue to walk this journey. Hi, hi.
Cookschaacham, a heartfelt thank you to both Dr. Lisa and Dr. Kisha, both for being here today for us. We also appreciate that you're going to be joining the Tk'emlúps Special Assembly to answer any questions, concerns, or further information that the community members who are the caretakers of these missing children may have for you. We also look forward to next Thursday, the 22nd, for that free webinar for all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit organizations and communities, and you can find more information on the Tk'emlúps website about that. At this time, it's my pleasure to call upon again Kamloops Secwépemc Cookbee, Rosanne Casimir, to talk about some next steps.
Excellent. Cookschaacham for those presentations. And, it's very important that we have, all these steps laid out and that path forward for the utmost dignity and respect. And that path, is going to guide us. So looking at some of these next steps, we'll be looking at the student records. Tk'emlúps Secwépemc has a responsibility and the obligation to identify the unmarked graves found within our jurisdiction. A critical first aspect to achieving those burdens is full and complete disclosure of the records held by the Canadian government and the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, specifically the student attendance records that were created by the institutions that were administered the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Those primary documents currently within the custody of the Canadian government will be of critical importance to identify those lost children. Every student who ever attended Kamloops Indian Residential School is documented in those records. We are loath to put the responsibility of identifying those lost on the survivors of Kamloops Indian Residential School who have been traumatized and re-traumatized already. Thus, we call on Prime Minister Trudeau and the Canadian government to share those attendance records as a first step in assisting Tk'emlúps Secwépemc in fulfilling their obligations regarding those lost without acknowledgement and as steps towards reconciliation. Similarly, the Tk'emlúps Secwépemc calls upon the Oblates of Mary Immaculate to assist in our sacred duties by opening up their records immediately and fully. Supports that enable the Kamloops Secwépemc to undertake this important work both immediately and for the long term. The Kamloops Secwépemc has worked diligently to prepare and submit a well thought out budget to immediately commence the important work to confirm and identify the missing children in our care. We're calling upon both the federal and the provincial governments to provide immediate and ongoing funding and supports to Tk'emlúps Secwépemc as we develop and implement frameworks and processes to further identify, document, maintain, and protect the remains of the children found buried at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. The site itself and any additional supports required in undertaking this difficult work. Access to experts is absolutely critical. This work requires resources that includes dedicated and qualified personnel to bring truth to light and peace to family members of the missing children. This is what drove us to reach out to the Canadian Archaeological Association and the Institute of Indigenous and Prairie Archaeology. It is also why we are offering a free webinar next week on remote sensing and grave detection in partnership with them. The Kamloops Indian Residential School was the largest in the Indian Affairs residential school system. From oral tellings of survivors and the records that have been able to be accessed to date, we understand that students came from across British Columbia, some from Alberta, and as far as the Yukon and into the States. To effectively work in the immediate and long term, both the Kamloops Secwépemc and the home communities of the missing children must be fully included and fully and duly resourced. The Kamloops Secwépemc needs to be able to take care of our community members, our survivors, and intergenerational survivors. Our community members continue to seek a healing center and programs that are trauma-informed as well as trauma-specific and reflect our Secwépemc values and culture. This is an urgent matter of health and well-being that needs to be supported both in the immediate and in the long term. Oral tellings from survivors. Kamloops Indian Residential School survivors, along with other residential school survivors, have come forward from across the country expressing interest to share their experiences and truths relating to missing children, deaths, unmarked graves, and experiences at residential school. The Tk'emlúps Secwépemc Oral Testimony Project will work in service to Tk'emlúps Secwépemc and Kamloops Indian Residential School survivors and intergenerational survivors who wish to share their testimonies by recording, preserving, and making them accessible in accordance with survivors and community's direction. Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond will be working to guide the process to ensure that it meets the community requirements and also respects the human rights and choice of survivors to talk about their experiences as they feel is necessary and appropriate. A 1-800 number and an email address will be provided at a later date for those who wish to participate in the Oral Tellings project. The Kamloops Secwépemc is ensuring that a comprehensive range of health and cultural supports will be available to survivors during the process and will be providing updates about partnerships involved in this very important endeavor. Cook's Jam.
At this time, it is my honor to call forward some survivors to provide their statements. Again, I would like to remind you, for people here in the room, that we have culture and wellness supports just through these doors in the Columbia Room. And for those online, I'd like to remind you that there are wellness supports that are well publicized in 1-800 numbers. I'd like to first start off by calling forward Kia Evelyn Camille. We are very fortunate today that we're going to have 3 survivors share with us today, and then we'll move on to further parts of our program. Thank you. Stay here.
Wait, Hodgetts, and Charles Quest, Evelyn Camille, Tk'emlúps, and Charles Nest, the Tk'emlúps, I'm at the residential school 10 years. I attended the residential school for 10 years. I can't remember the age that I entered, but at that time, it was legal to leave the residential school at the age of 16. And I was on my 16th year, I tried to get letters home to tell my parents to come and pick me up on the day of my birthday so I can go home. But as many of you know, or may not know, that all letters sent home was censored. They tell us to write letters home to our parents, which made us very happy because it was the only contact we had with our parents, is some letters sent home. In my letters, I had tried to explain the abuse that was happening in residential schools. For me, it is very hard to talk about it. I didn't even talk about the abuse in residential schools to my children. And today they're shocked to hear all what is happening, especially finding of the babies. And I told my youngest daughter, no, I didn't want you to know what happened to me. I was ashamed to be a Secwépemc. That's what residential schools taught me, to be ashamed of my identity. After walking the red road and learning who I was, which took many years in pushing back the abuses of residential schools, to learn of my identity. As many of us know how hard it is that have gone to residential schools. The residential schools were specifically built to take the Indian out of us, to take away our language, culture, and traditions, and to make us some astute. But it did not work. As our culture, language, and way of life is still with us. It will always remain with us to know our identities. Our children must know who they are. At a late age, my children came. Why didn't you tell us? I couldn't share my sorrows with them. Even though I had sent them to a Catholic school, St. Anne's Academy. Why did you send us to Quiet School, the black robe school, knowing what I went through? They questioned me later, why? At that time, I had known that the St. Anne's Academy had the highest academic standards, and I wanted my children to have the best of education until we built our own school. And now many communities have built their own school, and the way of life is being taught to the children. The respect for our culture and traditions, and the way of life of our people, of our sacred ceremonies, must not be forgotten. To hear, when I heard of the babies being found, of this, during our residential school settlement, we had tried to mention over and over and over, there are many children missing who did not reach home. Many ran away. And in that river, we know where the Kamloops Indian Residential School is. Many of our children tried to cross the rivers to swim across. Many were lost in the waters. My oldest sister, Irene, used to talk about them. Those children did not reach home. Many of our children who ran away during the winter and froze to death on their way home. And the Tk'emlúps, the black robes, start lying about the children. Oh yeah, they're doing fine here. In the meantime, they were missing, and no one had searched for them. Many tried to run away from these, I don't want to call them schools, because I didn't learn anything there. I was there 10 years. When I took the college entrance program, I had grade 4 level. all we did was cook and clean, and you know, we starved, and yet we had to steal much of our food in order to survive, and that's only part of our survival in residential schools. The residential schools was built to beat our language, culture, and traditions out of us. It was meant to break up our families. We know our families were strong. It was meant to break up our communities. We had very strong communities. I remember those days. We had a chief, we had a roaming chief that used to go from, or a judge. We had our own justice. We had our own child welfare system. We didn't depend on a child welfare to tell you you're raising your children wrong, you gotta do it this way. Sorry, we have to take your children because you're not doing the right thing. We had our own child welfare system. If a family needed help, others were there. Our community was one to look after each other. But these residential schools took that away from us. Our language, our way of life, broken up families still happen today. With the child and family services, we have to end that system and be responsible for our own children in our communities. That was how it was, and that is how it should be. The responsibility of our children is the families, the community. Sorry about that. I was swearing up and down, and when I'm going to come up here, I want the truth to be out, and I'm going to be strong. But to think of what happened to many children. The way I heard the news about the remains being found was a shock. A piece of paper was stuck to my door. I didn't even see who delivered it. I don't think that was considerate of bringing the news to elders. And I was home alone. I opened that letter. I was in shock. My daughter came home. She said, "What's the matter?" I showed her the letter. But we have a very strong family. We support each other, and they came. We had a supper, and we tried to talk about it. They asked, "Why didn't you tell us? Do you talk to your family about the abuse that you had, the sexual abuse from the Tk'emlúps, the black robes?" No. And the truth and reconciliation. I often wondered, what the hell does that mean? Do they want to hear the truth, really? We have tried to tell them the truth. And who are they? Who is going to listen? Reconciliation, they threw a few silver coins to us. Did that make me feel better? No. what made it worse is many of our survivors. It killed many of our survivors who could not heal themselves from the drug and the alcohol that was introduced to our people. We lost many during that settlement. That settlement did not help heal many of the wounds. Yes, it made my life a little better for a little while. I try to take lots of notes here, but it's all scribbly, you know how you try to keep notes. Once again, I thank you for giving me this time to speak what is in my heart. I'm very saddened about the findings. Although we did try to say a long time ago to tell the people, the politics, that many of our survivors are missing. Now, what next is what I want to know. What I want to know, what I would like to see is the burial site to be left undisturbed. Yes, there may have to be some studies to be done. What good are those studies going to do for us, for an individual, for me? It's going to tell me that, yes, they were murdered by Tk'emlúps. Is that going to make me feel better? I don't think so. Those remains should be left undisturbed. I had tried to go down there to say prayers, but I couldn't even cross some line. And I still would like to do that if I could get permission from whoever is responsible to look after the site, to say prayers for the remains that are found. And now that they are found, we believe that we must guide them home to finish their journey. And that is, we had a prayer night which helped a lot. But individually, we may have relatives there. Of course, they are our relatives. We need to do our personal way of healing and letting go. I think that's all for now. Thank you for giving me the time to speak.
thank you for your patience. After something like that, I wanted to check in with the other survivors. And just for everybody knowing, that was Evelyn Camille, Tk'emlups Secwépemc or Elder Knowledge Keeper, and Evelyn is Evelyn, Camille, Camille. At this time, it is my honor to call forward Leona Thomas.
Thank you, Evelyn. Good morning, everyone. Initially, I said no to this request, but I think it's really important for our younger generations to understand, be informed and be educated, and moving forward. Take the courage and strength that Evelyn shared with us, and many, 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 many more survivors across this country. I remember my first day entering that building across the river. I was 6 years old, from 1958 to 1963 inclusive. And then 64, 65, 66, 67 to day school. I was taken from a loving home that only knew humor, laughter, love, and honor. Put into a cold, stark environment that didn't honor or respect who we were. That could not comfort a 6-year-old who was crying, wanting to go home, or wanting to be with her brother whom she was not allowed to speak with. I jumped on my brother's back going through those front doors, and they had to pry me from him. That was the first time we were ever separated. For those of you who have children that age, grandchildren that age, just imagine what that would feel like. I was put into a dancing group that learned every ethnic dance except my own. I knew how to Irish jig, I knew how to 8-hand reel, I knew how to do the Mexican hat dances. And through that learning process, this is where the abuse was really amplified. It took me a long time to be able to cry. It was difficult to be able to share emotions. Today, not so much. I cry when I'm happy, I cry when I'm sad, and I cry when I'm joyful. I'm grateful for my late aunt as I entered my teenage years to bring a group of us from our community to learn our own Secwépemc songs and dances. I proudly shared the swan song and taught my granddaughters when they were young to create an understanding of where they come from, a part of where they come from. I want to end by having you participate in this small little exercise so you can get a better understanding of what some of us experienced. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to imagine you have a 6-year-old daughter that's been taken away from you. You have no choice. You have no one to turn to. No one believes you. That little girl, for the next 5 years, has to go into an environment that shows no love, no hugs, no support, nothing but verbal, emotional, spiritual abuse. When I was going through the claim, the federal lawyer kept asking, if there was so much abuse, why did you take it? And I replied to her, what 6-year-old child could say no? Those are the types of comments that were made, not only to me, but probably everyone who had to go through that process. It's not an easy way to share experiences that have only been shown you as shame. I agree with Evelyn that our identity, our dignity, and our self-esteem was really eroded. Our ability to speak. I can't speak my language today because of what I experienced across that way. I've tried. I've gotten so many beatings for speaking my language that I'm sure that there's a subconscious block that just didn't allow me to do it. But that's okay. I challenge, in my closing here, I challenge each and every one of you to really educate yourself around those 97 calls to action. Understand what the truth really means to us, to our families, to our nations, and push for effective reconciliation through our educational institutions, in our communities. Push your leadership to move in the right direction. And lastly, I really want to acknowledge the newly appointed National Chief. I love the fact that it's going to be a female that's leading us. Thank you for listening to me.
Oh, thank you so much. That was Leona Thomas. Leona, Leona, Thomas, Thomas, Leona Thomas. We're just going to make a quick adjustment here to accommodate Jules, who is our last survivor to testify today or to provide her statement. She's going to go right here. So for the camera person right there, I'm going to ask you to move back. She's going to go right here to the front in front of this monitor here. If we could get a chair brought to the front and get her mic'd up as well, please. We're just going to take a moment for that. Again, for those in the room, I'd like to remind you that there are culture and wellness supports provided just outside in the Columbia room, just out to the doors to my left. And for everybody watching online, again, it's very well publicized, the various 1-800 numbers, crisis intervention, as well as Indian Residential School Survivor Society crisis line. And we encourage you to reach out if you so need it. So we are so thankful that Jules started us off in a good way, and now she has chosen to come forward to share her statement as a survivor. That is Mona Jules, M-O-N-A, Jules, J-U-L-E-S. This will be our last survivor speaking today, and I'm going to ask for media to please use your utmost discretion. We are not including our survivors as part of the media event, and I also would check with anybody who's accompanying them whether or not they wish to be interviewed, and I would ask that you refrain if that's at all possible. At this time, we're going to now go to Mona Jules.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mona Jules. My Aboriginal name is Milmanatqua. And I'm a residential school survivor. I started there around 1947-48 and continued at about age 6 or 7. I entered the school there. And it wasn't by family choice, it was the government choice. And in doing my research about the residential school and the death of those children, back in the 1500s, the Pope had ordered the death of children that were gathered up and put in those schools. If they were not Catholic, to kill them. That was a cold, terrible command coming from someone in a high position. I forgot what the title of that report was. It's a field study of something. It's got a 3-word title. And it's contradicting the report that I had just finished doing a couple of weeks back for the Kamloops band. But going from there, the children that were found there, you know, had suffered greatly. We were taken away from parents, loving, warm, loving families. We were not rich, you know, and probably looked very poor, but we were loved, and the homes were warm. We were rich because we had farm animals, we had fields of vegetables growing. We were not really poor in the sense that we weren't probably richly clothed and so on, but we were rich in many other ways. We had grandparents and parents who spoke fluently, and we all lived together. I had about 12 siblings. Every one of us were fluent in the language, and my grandmother made sure of that. She absolutely refused to speak English. And when we went to the residential school, all of that changed. And when I got there at a young age, I couldn't understand anyone. The whole school sounded like a beehive. The buzzing and the noise, I just looked from face to face. I couldn't understand anything. And when I first got there on my first day, the principal carried me up the stairs, up to the dorm. And I often wondered years later if that was correct. You know, was it right for him to do that? Everyone was at a movie. He took me upstairs, found a bed for me, and the bed seemed very high. I couldn't get off it after he left. And he helped me on with a nightgown and asked me if I knew how to say my prayers. I told him, yes, I know how to say my prayers. I was shaking my head. I could understand him a little bit because I had older siblings who had attended the school. And they spoke English, but when they spoke to my grandmother and the rest of us, they had to speak the language. So everybody was gone. I was alone in that dark dorm, and I cried myself to sleep. I was wondering when my mother would come to pick me up. You know, when was my mom and dad going to show up and rescue me, take me away from this cold place. We had siblings, but we were all separated. My brother was taken to the boys' side. My older sister was taken to a different part of the school. So we were all separated. And after hearing about those children being found along the orchards and other places, I often wondered what would have happened if I hadn't been able to say my night prayers in my language. Would my life have been snuffed out because I wasn't Catholic? My mother and my grandmother were very devout Catholics, and they taught us prayers, night prayers, and so on in our language. And they had great respect for the church, and they trusted the priests and the nuns. But I was horrified. You know, my mother always said, oh, those nuns are so beautiful. You know, they're like angels. And so when they came to take us, they were totally in trust. But they were told if we weren't allowed to go there, that my parents would be taken away by the police and put in jail. So later on, when my brother was about 10, 12 years old, my father took him to hunting camp and kept him there for 2 weeks. And eventually he said, I'm not going back to school. I'm going to be going fishing to the fish camp pretty soon. But first of all, I'm going away with Dad and Grandpa to go hunting for a while. And then eventually I saw him at school and in the class. I walked up to him and asked him, I thought you were staying home. I thought you were at fish camp. And he said, no, the police came and threatened to take Dad. I had to come back. So the nun who was supposedly the teacher asked me, who were you talking to? I told her that was my brother. And she said, your brother. So I thought, accusing. I was only 8 or 10 years old, for heaven's sakes. And I couldn't understand why she used that tone of voice with me. You know, as putting shame in me at that age for speaking to my brother. And we weren't allowed to speak to family at, you know, any age. I thought that was not right, but we couldn't have a voice that anyone could listen to. You could scream and cry and beg, and there was no one there to rescue you. We were strapped and beaten. You could scream and scream. There was no one there to come to your help. And when I watched that residential school report a few years ago, where these people came to your rescue, I thought, that isn't even true. That never happened. You know, that film that they showed was not the truth. the abusive situation there that they showed is probably true. I probably would have been abused, except I had a 13-year-old sister who passed away in that school. And my father wasn't, my mom and dad were not notified until after the fact. So when they got there, they told my mom and dad that she had gotten sick and died. She was 13. And they wanted to know why wasn't she taken to a doctor, to the hospital. It was right across the bridge. And there were no answers. My father beat the principal up so badly, knocked him down from floor to floor, past the entrance, down towards the dining room stairs, and he ended up in the hospital. I don't know how my father stopped beating on him, but he was so upset about the death of my sister. My mother, of course, never spoke English, and she was just beyond, being comforted. She never ever went back to that school to visit any of us over the years because of that. So my father got a reputation for being an abusive father because of that situation. And I was asked over the years to come and speak to a group, and I didn't know it was a room full of principals. And I told them that story, and I told them, if anyone ever lays a hand on my grandchildren, I would go storming in the school to raise hell with everyone there. So I found out later that they were all principals there, and one of them had stood up and spoken up after. I worked as a language coordinator for 15 years at the Secwépemc Cultural Education Society, and I spent my life reviving the language among anyone and everyone who wanted to learn. I taught for Simon Fraser University as a second course at night. I worked from 8 till 4 for the language department, and from 4:30 till 8 o'clock for Simon Fraser, teaching the language. And I started that in '97, but before that, I worked with linguists and specialists to set up reading and writing programs. I was fluent in the language, but I had to learn how to read and write it in order to teach it. So that took many years. I continued and finally retired in December of 2020. And then my health started deteriorating rapidly soon after. So I've spent years trying to revive what that school had snuffed out. And it's working. We have many of our young people who speak it, and they're running language departments, having meetings in the language, speaking to one another. I still work with them when I can, and I'll continue to do that for as long as I can. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to the survivors of the residential school.
To everybody present here today in this room, to everybody online, I make no apologies for extending the time to fully hear whatever our survivors wish to share with us today. I also want to ensure that it's understood. To be clear, there was a question from the media. We are not connecting media to survivors. We created this space for those who wish to come forward. We asked for some who wish to come forward to share their truth. It is hard as you bore witness today. It will continue to be hard as they deal with their truth telling. So we are not having them participate in the media event. And we are refraining from offering their contact information for follow-up interviews. For due respect, they have taken the time today, and we give our most heartfelt gratitude, love, and respect to Evelyn Camille, Leona Thomas, and Mona Jules. We know that now that you have unpacked yourselves and those memories, there is some repacking and healing, and we know that it is a journey that you have chosen to take on our behalf, at our bequest, and we thank you, and we pray for that healing and that being heard to provide at least some measure of comfort. We see you. At this time, it is my honor to call upon newly elected National Chief RoseAnne Archibald from the Assembly of First Nations.
Miigwech, everyone. The first thing I would like to do is I have some medicine here. Most of it's from Ontario. It's tobacco, cedar, sweetgrass, and sage. And I want to formally give it to Kisha Supernant, and it's a gift from us. Miigwech. I do want to take some time. This is a very emotional moment, and I would like to ask everybody to join me in just grounding ourselves before I start speaking. We've had some very powerful elders, knowledge keepers share with us, and so what I like to do is put my hands over my heart, so I'm going to invite you all just to put your hands over your hearts. And just to breathe into this space. This is where our love is. This is what we have to ground our work in as we move through this very difficult time. Just keep breathing into that space so that we can ground ourselves in love. Miigwech. Ochimaswe. Okawakanik, Okawakanishishuk, Gishehok, Esquewak, Nishta Oshkanigwak, RoseAnne Archibald, Nitishnikassan, Dago Dagamosh, Gatako. Good morning, everyone. First, I want to acknowledge the Creator, the world around us, and our place within it. I'm honored to be here in Tk'emlups, Secwépemc traditional territory, and acknowledge all of you who are watching virtually on your traditional lands. Miigwech, Tk'emlups, Secwépemc Cultural and Language Revitalization Department for the welcoming song, and Knowledge Keeper Mona Jules for the opening prayer. I raise my hands to Kamloops Secwépemc Chief Rosanne Casimir, her council, the community, BC, AFN Regional Chief Terry Tiji, Kupki Wilson, Kupki Christian, Chief Tom, and Robert Phillips. Phyllis Wobstead, Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler, elders, dignitaries, special guests, Mayor of Kamloops, and all the other chiefs who are joining us online. Most importantly, I would like to say miigwech to the Kamloops Indian Residential School survivors who are joining us here in person, and all of those survivors who are watching online. Ninanaskamun, which in my language means I am thankful, I am grateful, I thank you. Ninanaskamun, Evelyn Camille, Leona Thomas, Mona Jules, who spoke their truth so powerfully. Let's also remember all the little ones who never made it home. I also want to acknowledge the intergenerational survivors. Anishinaabe scholar Dr. Pamela Toulouse wrote, 100% of First Nations people suffer from intergenerational trauma, 100%. We are all survivors, and we are all doing our best to heal and walk forward with dignity. This is an important day for us as First Nations people, as Indigenous people. Here in Secwépemc territory, in these sacred lands, Canadians and the world first learned about how 215 innocent children died and were buried in unmarked graves. This is a crime against humanity. This is a crime against little children. The United Nations has called this genocide. We call this genocide. This ground-penetrating radar technology is revealing evidence, undisputable proof that crimes were committed. Chief Cadmus Delorme, when speaking about the children in Cowessess, stated, "This is a crime scene." And crimes have to be investigated. The criminals must be held to account. What's equally important is that these little ones were loved. We heard one of the elders say that earlier. They were cared for by their families and communities when they were forcibly removed, often by the RCMP and Indian agents. Certainly, it started with government policy, with the collusion of religious institutions, in this case, the Catholic Church. The report findings today show that this recovery of our children is not over, and there will be many reports to come. On Monday, we learned of the recovery of the ancestors in Tk'emlúps First Nation, and my prayers go out to them. People and media have been referring to them as discoveries. These are not discoveries. These are recoveries. It's time to find our children and bring them home. This agonizing exercise and grim reminder of this country's history will continue until we recover all of our family members and bring them home to rest in peace through proper ceremony. For many Canadians and people around the world, these recent recoveries of our children, buried, nameless, unmarked, lost and without ceremony is shocking and unbelievable, but not for us. We have always known, and we heard one of the knowledge keepers say that earlier, we have always known from the very beginning that many of our children did not survive. The ones that did return were silent, as one of the elders said, but some of them told the stories of horror and abuse. This has been happening since the inception of the residential schools since the 1800s and continued for another century until 1996. 1996, when the last of these institutions was closed for good. But even after these institutions of assimilation and genocide closed, survivors and thousands of families continue to suffer. Some never talked about the horrors that they witnessed. So their children, their grandchildren, and descendants are now coming to terms with the fallout. This has been a very difficult time for us as a nation, as we are reminded once again about Canada's assimilation policies that were meant to extinguish us as a people. Again, make no mistake, this is genocide. As the newly elected AFN National Chief, I am working with urgency on the issue of the burial sites across this country and looking for ways to heal the trauma that our people have experienced for generations. I have spoken to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and made a reasonable and fair request for more resources and funding to help us look for our little ones who have suffered enough and to, most importantly, help bring them home. As a people, we are hurt, we are angry, we are saddened by these recoveries. I know this, and I have seen firsthand speaking to people across this country. They demand action, not promises, not moments of silence. Our young people are expressing their rage and hurt by toppling statues and burning churches. But we must do more than tear down the symbols of destructive colonization. I ask our allies to stand shoulder to shoulder with us to rebuild, recover, heal, and move forward together. I ask every Canadian to stand with First Nations as we continue this painful but important work. I ask you to listen, learn, and reflect on the history that we share as a country. Please continue to call Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Continue to call your Premier. Continue to call your MP. Continue to call your MPPs to demand reparations, justice, to demand justice and action, not only for our little ones, but for your children and little children everywhere. There must be truth before reconciliation, and there is much to do, and my team and the AFN regional chiefs have hit the ground running. There is great hope and light as we move to rebuild, restructure, and heal. Let's bring our little ones home. Ninanaskamon, again, which means I am thankful, I am grateful, I thank you, and Gisakitin, which means I love you.
My goodness. At this time, it's my honor to call upon for a final time for this public presentation Tk'emlúps Secwépemc Cookbee Rosanne Casimir for some closing remarks.
Well, first of all, I just want to take a deep breath. Feel that. And, I just want to say Kuksjatchum to our survivors who had shared today. That meant so much. And to hear that, those truths, to be shared. Kuksjam. Kuksjam. So, again, I just want to thank everyone here who was here to witness, to share, and learn the information that we have to date. And, hearing some of those steps that are going forth and next. And so I just wanted to, close with a few remarks and statements. So first of all, I just wanted to say to the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, we're still waiting for you to reach out to us to acknowledge the latest truths from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. I look forward to a fulsome conversation where we can finalize the details of the federal government providing the needed supports as well as access to our student records, and also to continue to shed light on our missing children that are buried in our care. We also want to invite you to come and join us in our powwow arbor this September 30th to interact with the Kamloops Indian Residential School survivors for the very first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. To everyone who joined us today, being in person or virtually, thank you. Kuksjatchum. A special thanks for National Chief RoseAnne Archibald for coming to join us today to bear witness, but also speak truth to power on the next steps for a national plan. Kuksjam. Now, aware of their lost loved ones, maybe buried, home communities and families of missing children, we seek peace and knowing as soon as possible. Now the cries of the missing children have been heard, and it's time to show them much love, much honor, and much respect. That means swiftly forming a team of archaeological and other technical experts so that the process begin immediately, confirming, identifying, and repatriating the children. We also acknowledge that the work done to date represents but a fraction of the Kamloops Indian Residential School grounds, and oral tellings indicate that more investigation in other areas is required. This is a long process that will take significant time and resources. They were children robbed of their families and their childhood. We need to now give them the dignity that they never had. Those are our next steps.
Kuksjatchum, thank you so very much, Cookbee, Rosanne Casimir. Thank you to everybody joining us today for the public presentation. You're very welcome to stay for the media event and listen to the questions that are going to be asked to speakers here today. As I have indicated, we are not calling upon the survivors. We are so grateful for the heavy lifting they already did today. We're just going to take a very short break just to transition to, with technology and everything else, for the setup for the media event. I do have to be a party pooper, remind you. Unfortunately, the milling that we're used to doing due to COVID protocols, it is stated through our public health authorities that that is not the sort of thing that people want or is encouraged to do today. Again, if you're double vaccinated and it's been more than 14 days, a mask is not required but is recommended. So Cookschatchim, thank you so very much everybody for joining us today. We're going to take a very short break for everybody who's still online and wishes to participate. We're just going to take a very short break. Thank you.